Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the latest in a series of webinars hosted by the International Woodsmoke Researchers Network. Today we're going to hear from my colleague here at NIWA in Auckland, Guy Coulson. Guy has been the group manager for air quality for I think 11 years? 11 years and a bit. And Guy is going to be wrapping up all the research that's happened while he's been here. So this is 10 years and a little bit more of wood smoke research in New Zealand. Over to Guy.
Right. Thank you, Ian. First thing I need to do is check that everyone can hear me. Good, because I have a tendency to march up and down whilst I'm talking. So thank you for turning out, and thank you to those who are watching on the web. So what I'd like to do is, this is basically a potted history of wood burner research in New Zealand over the past decade or so. Wood smoke research in New Zealand goes back further than that. One of the earliest ones I managed to track down was 20 years ago. So David Ratt, Tony Bromley and friends doing some work on wood smoke in the Hutt Valley. But this really goes back to around 2004 or so. I mean, before I came to New Zealand. But there's when interest in wood smoke as a source of pollution really started to ramp up. So to start with, for those not familiar with New Zealand, this is what most people generally think of when we talk about New Zealand. These are the publicity photographs. This is what's in all the holiday adverts. And for a good proportion of the time, it does look like that. It's a really lovely place. But sometimes it looks like that. And this is Tokoroa, I think, and sort of in the middle of the North Island. During winter, wood burning is one of the major sources of heating, particularly in smaller towns. And the ones that are in valleys and bowls suffer from inversions, and this happens. And a similar photograph of Masterton, again, south end of the North Island. And what I really like about this picture is the way that the smoke just stops dead at the edge of town, showing you how still conditions are. This stuff is just not going anywhere. And air quality in New Zealand, we're an island in the middle of the Pacific. So all our pollution is our own fault. We don't have any neighbours. We don't suffer from long-range transport. Occasionally you see the occasional Australian bushfire or dust storm in the instrumental record, but they are very rare. And pretty much all of our pollution comes from either wood burners in winter or from vehicles. And we have a very aging car fleet. The average age of cars in New Zealand is now something like about 14 years, which means there's lots of 30-year-old cars out on the road. Industry is a fairly small proportion of our air pollution, somewhere around or less than 10%. So a lot of the work, particularly the earlier work, was around testing the emissions of wood burners in a real-life situation. A lot of the work going on around the world is lab-based. So people take wood burners into labs and try and measure emissions under controlled conditions. But of course, once the wood burners get out into the wild, all that goes completely out the window and everything is under not controlled conditions. So around 2004-05, various people went out to try and devise ways of measuring real-life emissions from wood burners. And there was something like about 7 or 8 campaigns over a period of 6, 7 years, 8 years, something like that, in various places around New Zealand. And that led to a series of reports and papers on real-life emissions as measured in various houses around the country. But it wasn't entirely about emissions, just mostly about emissions. There has been other research going on over the years, but I'll come to that in a little while. So of the real life emissions measurements, and there were something like 51 wood burners measured in total from about 390 days worth of measurements. People who did this were people like Jeff Blewett, Emily Wilton, Angie, I've forgotten Angie's second name, sorry Ange. Sorry, Angie Scott, yes. And various other colleagues going back more than 10 years now. But what you can see is that there's very large variation. These cover 6 different campaigns, and these are the average value from each campaign. But you can see that there is a huge amount of variation across those campaigns. But one thing that links all of them is that the distribution of those emissions is always log normal. Doesn't matter which campaign it was or which measurements it was, you always end up with a log normal distribution. So if you take the old style burners, we ended up with an emissions factor of somewhere around 9 or 10 grams per kilogram of wood burnt. And if you look at modern, what are known as compliance burners, and for those who are not from New Zealand, our national environmental standards stipulate what wood burners are allowed to be installed in houses, and they have to go through a type approval process that limits them to 1.5 grams per kilogram as measured in a laboratory. Again, when you take those out into the real world, the emissions factors that we've measured end up somewhere around 4 grams per kilogram, not 1.5 at all. So what, I wasn't here at the time that all this started, so I've kind of pieced together the evolution of the question. So it started with simply for emissions inventory purposes, what are the emissions factors from wood burners? And so some of these campaigns were started to measure those emissions. And what people found was that there was very high variability in those emissions. So the next question becomes, well, what is the variability? How big is it? And so measured some more. And it's still very, very highly variable. And the question becomes one of statistics. How many have you got to measure before you can get a reliable average or median or useful statistic out of them? And then that question becomes, can you actually reduce the variability? And from a sort of physical science point of view, why are they being variable in the first place? So attempts to look at this, this comes from work by Emily Wilton and Jeff Blewett, to look at the factors that influenced particulate emissions from wood burners. One thing that I didn't state right at the beginning is this has all been about PM10 so far, because PM10 is what the national regulations stipulate. So that was what was measured. And early attempts to understand the variability basically came to the conclusion that the most important variable was the operator. It probably suggests that there are other variables not being measured, so subsequent campaigns started to measure more and more variables, and found that things like wood moisture, flue temperature, oxygen supply were all important in explaining the variation. But generally it still comes down to the most important variable being the person operating the wood burner. So then my colleague Richard Bian, who's a statistician, and I started to think about can we reduce that variability or understand that variability by combining all those measurements together? And the first question is it actually valid to combine all these different campaigns? Because they were measured in slightly different ways, slightly different places at slightly different times. And so it's not immediately obvious that it's something from a statistical point of view that you can do. Because if you look at the distributions, as I said, all the distributions are log normal, or if you put them on a normal axis, they're all highly skewed. But and they all have different means, but they all have more or less the same shape. But there is a way of determining whether that shape is always the same. And this is a technique known as kernel density estimates. Anybody wants to know anything more about that, you'll have to ask Richard. But what Richard found was that although the means vary, the shape of the distribution is always the same. So the conclusion being it is valid to compare all those different campaigns. And going back in, one of the questions was about if you just measure hundreds of burners, will that reduce your variability so that you can hone in on a single emissions factor? So, but if you look at the coefficient of variance across all those campaigns, basically the answer is no. Your variability is not linked to sample size. So simply measuring more in the same way will not reduce your variability. Basically, if you're going to carry on measuring this way, you have to live with that variability and just accept that you've got a log normal distribution and that your emissions are going to land somewhere within that distribution. Now, trying to find that single emissions factor is not going to happen. Basically, what conclusion I've come to is that the wood burner is a random number generator. But you know what the distribution of your random numbers are, so you can work with that. So it works across campaigns, but one of the limiting factors, I think, is that there's a limited number of measurements in each individual house. Some of them, one house we only have 3 days, the most we've got is 3 weeks. And the average is about 8 days worth of measurements. Again, the distributions are always the same. But one thing that would be interesting to try and do in the future would be to follow wood burners throughout an entire winter and see how they vary across a longer period of time. Because in these measurements, a wood burner can be a gross emitter one day and perfectly clean the next, with no particularly obvious reason apart from the operator. You know, I'm not from round here. You give me a wood burner and I can turn a low emissions wood burner into a high emissions wood burner very easily. And along with that, Shanju Ji and colleagues from Auckland Council, or what was then Auckland Regional Council, did a large set of lab tests looking for an emissions prediction model. And their results give the same kind of distribution. So you still get, even in a lab, you're still getting your log normal distributions. And it is possible, if you take those results, to make an emissions prediction model, but you need to know the make of the burner, the age of the burner, the type of wood, the wood moisture, and a whole lot of other variables to be able to predict it, which is really quite difficult to have available in real life. So moving on from measurement of emissions, people have done other work on Woodsmoke. This is the work of Joe Kavanagh at Landcare, working on toxicity of particles in general, and also looking at Woodsmoke. What Joe found was that there's a difference in particular places. So Auckland aerosol is has a different toxicity from Christchurch aerosol. One's more mutagenic and the other one causes more inflammatory response. I can't remember which is which now, but and it's down to the sources of the particles. So in Auckland you have more traffic-dominated aerosol. In Christchurch, you have a Woodsmoke dominated aerosol. And the other thing that Joe found was that pH emissions, PAH, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, don't appear to be going down despite movements to low emissions burners. But of course, the type approval for the burners is all about PM10 emissions. It's not about anything else. And throughout that time, a lot of work has been going on source apportionment, mainly driven by the team at Geological Nuclear Sciences, by virtue of the fact that they've got an ion beam. And they use this to do PIXI analysis on PM10 samples collected on filters. Whilst they're at it, they do X-ray fluorescence and measure VC and total carbon, and then use that to apportion sources for air quality management in New Zealand. They're also connected to international networks of source apportionment networks, but that's not specifically Woodsmoke. And so from the long-term data sets that they've been able to build up, because they can analyze historic filters going back decades that various councils around the country have been collecting, as well as collecting them specifically for this purpose. They've come to the conclusion that although the underlying PM and the black carbon appears to be going down, the contribution from Woodsmoke is still going up. And the other thing that they have been able to show is that there's a lot of metals in the Woodsmoke, particularly arsenic and lead. And wherever you look in New Zealand, in the Woodsmoke signal, they found arsenic. Doesn't matter where you go. So they've also found lead from people burning painted wood. Despite the fact that burning treated timber, painted wood, is not allowed anywhere as far as I know, people still do it. And I said, just basically said that, and it's the same pretty much wherever you look, you will find arsenic in the Woodsmoke signal. And also on composition, if you then put out networks of samplers to collect particles on filters, you can start to look at the spatial variation as well. And by analyzing the composition, you can apportion different sources, but you can do it spatially. And so this is work that we did in collaboration with then University of Pittsburgh, Jane Clufferty, who is now at Drexel University. And so the spatial patterns of Woodsmoke are different from spatial patterns of, for example, traffic, which is pretty much what you would expect, really. But the thinking behind this is to get high resolution exposure measurements for epidemiology studies. So when I first started getting interested in Woodsmoke, there was a general assumption that Woodsmoke was an area source because you had hundreds of chimneys in any given area, so you just assumed it was evenly distributed. And 10 years or so ago, we started doing mobile measurements around New Zealand, instrumented up a car and went for a drive at night time, and started to find that actually there is spatial variation within urban areas of wood smoke. So it's not evenly distributed at all. And you found things like there being 10 times more wood smoke in the valleys than on the ridges. So the smoke in New Zealand to some extent, particularly in Auckland, because we have a lot of geography. The people at the top of the hills are burning wood, the smoke is rolling down into the valleys and there it sits. It's a similar problem to alpine valleys in Europe and in North America. It's not uncommon, and it's what you would expect to find. And this is all from nighttime driving around. And you can apportion what you're measuring to either wood smoke or fossil fuel by various methods. The one I've shown here is using the ratio of black carbon to CO2. Wood smoke, that ratio is 3 times higher than for traffic pollution. And another way of doing it is if you use UV absorption to measure black carbon at different wavelengths, there is a difference in the absorption at different wavelengths depending on whether your source is biomass or fossil based. And also looking at the spatial variation, but of course the vertical profile. This is more work from the guys at GNS. They've shown that there is a profile. The profile changes overnight as time goes on, so it builds up, but that there's very little storage above where you're measuring. It sort of disappears very rapidly. And then if you own a wood burner, how's it affecting you in your house at home? Because everything we've done so far has been about measurements outside. Regulations are about measurements outside. But an opportunistic measurement as part of some of that real life stuff I mentioned earlier, measurement inside wood burning homes in Christchurch, showed that there are some very large peaks that are not connected to what's being measured outside. On this particular picture, the blue line is indoors, the red one is the compliance monitor a couple of kilometers away. And you can see the two really don't show very much correlation. And the question then becomes, what's causing those peaks? Is it starting the fire? Is it adding wood to the fire? Is it not your wood burner at all? Is it some other source? So looking at the bottom chart there, it's not. Sometimes when you add wood, you get a burst of particulate activity. Sometimes you don't. So this kind of needed investigating further. And is the wood smoke you're experiencing, is it from your burner? Is it directly coming out of your burner into your room? Is it going up the chimney outside and coming back in through the windows? Or is it next door or the houses around you? We had no real way of telling this. But basically the average indoor PM10 could be 2-3 times what was being measured outside, and it became very difficult to actually apportion indoor sources. So our colleague Gustavo who was a born tinkerer, went away and came back with what he called Pac-Man, which is a small box that's about 10 centimeters on a side, that box, based around an Arduino processor that had CO2 off-the-shelf sensors, and at the time, the sharp dust sensor, which were about $20 a piece, maybe less, and a rangefinder and a motion detector, so that you can put this little box is designed to be completely self-contained. You put it inside somebody's house and leave it there. And because we all know that when anybody's involved in an experiment, they change their behavior. Even if it's subconsciously, they always do. So the idea is that you can leave this thing hidden in a corner of somebody's room, and eventually they'll just forget it's there and go back to their normal lives. It's all open source. All the software, the instructions for the hardware are open source. So if anybody feels like building their own, please feel free. Just keep us informed, because one of the ideas was to be able to build a network to share data. And from the indoor measurement package also grew the outdoor one, which became known as ODIN, the Outdoor Dust Information Node. That is simply a dust sensor with temperature and humidity. It doesn't have all the other things attached to it. Partly so that it can run off solar power. So to keep the power requirements as low as possible, it's got as few sensors as we can get away with in it. So armed with an indoor and an outdoor low-cost sensor, we set up an experiment in Rangiora, just north of Christchurch. It's a town of about 12, 13,000 people, and it's fairly small, and as you can see from the photographs, it's more or less flat. And it has a reasonably well understood weather and wind regime. So it's the modelling should be straightforward. Not being a modeler, I can say things like that. And we wanted this to be a community-driven experiment. Part of what we were interested in is the question of why do people insist on setting fire to stuff? Yeah, and how can, if we gave people real-time feedback on what their activities were doing, would that modify behavior? We don't know. Let's go and find out. So we advertised for volunteers in Rangiora to be part of the experiment through adverts in the paper, through local community groups, schools, that kind of thing. And a reasonable number, about 10, 12, something like that, volunteered to be part of the experiment by having sensors in their houses. Other people just filled in a questionnaire. There's an online survey goes with this. Ayushi, how many people do the survey?
At the moment, about 8. In the first year, about 20.
Yeah, okay. So for the benefit of those who didn't hear that, so we had about 15 to 20 people doing the survey. That's dwindled a bit this year, but people are still doing it. So the first year of the Kona pilot study, 2015, during August and September that year, and we put out about 15 Odins around the town, similar number of Pac-Man inside people's houses. We had people filling in surveys, and we also had other houses that, although they didn't have Pac-Man, would have a thermocouple on their on their wood burner so that we can get information on wood burner usage. And alongside that, we set up various weather stations around the town. And Environment Canterbury, which is the local regional council, also has a compliance monitoring site in the middle of the town. So everything that we measured could be referenced to a compliance monitor. And we set up, alongside their monitoring network, we put a ceilometer up, and we put a network of weather stations around the outside of the town to get a good understanding of what the flow regimes are in the area. And there's also a blog which people can go and have a look at. It gives you it's updated as we go along. Can people contribute to that as well? They can comment. Okay, good. So anyway, it's an open invitation for people to go and have a look at the Kernel blog. So most of this I've already gone through. Basically, there was apart from those who were contacted directly and became part of the experiment, there's also online recruitment for people to take part in the survey. The survey just talks about people's perceptions of wood smoke, whether it's a good day, a bad day, whether they're using their wood burner this time or not. So fairly simple questions like that. So from this, we start to build up an idea of what the heating activity is. You know, when do people light their burners? When do they stop using them? Because it's been quite hard to. One of the problems about the emissions is just understanding people's burner usage to be able to attribute emissions to these things. And as part of this, we wanted, as I mentioned, we wanted to feed back this information to people so that they understood how their activities and their behaviour was impacting their own exposure to wood smoke alongside that of their neighbours, and to have a look at what interventions might actually make a difference. So we experimented with lots of different ways of presenting this to people. Pac-Man initially and the Odins are, each one is standalone. It has a memory card in it, so you have to physically go along, take the memory card out, and then produce the statistical summaries after the event. One of the things we're working on at the moment is networking them so that we can have real-time data out of them, but we haven't got that up and running yet. So we tried out various different ways of presenting this to people. We would give them booklets, basically, of charts of various ways of explaining what we'd measured and what we thought it meant. So there would be, it's basically charts of what we measured with our commentary to try and help people understand it. So there'd be ones like this. I'm just going to run through a few. I'm not going to talk about them in any great detail, but just to give you an idea of the approaches that we would take to explain what was going on. So this one in particular was, we could identify bursts of particles occurring, and so we can then link that to surveys, see when people are actually, what activities are taking place at that time. And of course, one of the things that we always assumed a priori was that fire lighting was a major source of particles in a home. But what we found so far is that that's not usually the case. We're not entirely sure why that should be yet. We're working on it, but that was just one particularly interesting result. And it's just a way of showing a time series, if you like, of how wood smoke comes and goes compared to just wood smoke coming in from outside, compared with the bursts happening in your house from using your fire or other indoor sources such as cooking, pets, whatever it might be. And we try and use that to identify the sources by having sensors in different parts of the house. So you can look at the lags between the different peaks arriving. If you see it in the kitchen first, then it's probably cooking. If you see it in the living room first, it may well be the fire or something else. And another way of displaying it is like this, so that just little circles superimposed so you can see which event was detected first. And then the sensor technology has been improving steadily and fairly rapidly over the past few years. So over the past couple of years, we've started using, instead of the sharp sensor that we used originally, we've tried out various different off-the-shelf particle sensors, and we've moved to this one by Plantower, and it is able to, something like the Sharp just gives you a voltage. You have to calibrate it yourself. You have to work out what it's telling you. And you have to put a lot of effort into this. The people who make this have done all that for you, and it is now clever enough to report PM1, PM2.5, and PM10. So the SD stands for size distribution. We've extensively tested them and found them to be very stable. Each one needs calibrating individually. And we generally do that by, as in this picture, by just putting them all next to a regulatory compliance station for a while. And this is the one in Rangiora. So at the beginning of the season, they're all put out next to the compliance monitor. Each one is calibrated against it. And once that's done, they appear to be very stable. And with any luck, it is working. So what we're looking at here is the concentrations measured at various locations around Rangiora with the wind direction and speed indicated by the arrows, to look at how the weather affects where the emissions go to. So your own emissions may not affect you. They will be transported somewhere and affect people in another part of town. And that's one way of displaying it. Or we can now start to construct these reasonably high resolution maps of the spatial patterns of PM across the town. And you can see that there are sort of fairly steep spatial gradients there. And this is because sensors that are very close to each other, within 100 meters, 200 meters of each other, can see very different things depending on exactly where they are in town, which of course leads to questions about the representativeness of central monitoring locations. And ultimately, we can look at the spatial and temporal variation in quite good detail by having these dense networks of monitors over a period of time. And if we're lucky, you can produce animations like this, Well, this is over 2 days in August last year and shows the build-up and transport of PM2.5 across Rangiora. So we're now in our 3rd season in Rangiora. This year we've got 8 homes being censored up. We've moved from thermocouples to eye buttons. There's a picture of one in that photograph at the bottom. Just very small devices for measuring and recording temperature, and also doing daily surveys. The participants doing daily surveys. But this year, apart from having the network across the whole of the town, somewhere about nowish, we're going to condense that down into a very dense network right in the centre of town to try and look at how steep those gradients actually are, and how they change with over very short distances. So the new maps, the new animations will come out very shortly. We're currently working on the next generation of Pac-Man. So most of the original ones have reached the end of their useful working life. A new generation has been designed and will be built shortly. Colleagues at Massey University in the architecture department there are building a number of next generation Pac-Man for work in a study in schools that they're doing. And then after this Southern Hemisphere winter, all our kit will be packed off to Idaho to work with colleagues from University of Montana in a similar study that is being carried out there. Okay, so that was a very quick rush through something like 10 years of, slightly over 10 years of research into wood smoke. A lot of it has been based around emissions, but not all of it. So on the emissions front, the emissions from wood burners are very variable, but they always have a log normal distribution. And the variance appears to be due to fuel quality, fuel moisture, and the human factor, if you like, around maintenance and how they operate the burner. The variation within a single house is very high, but we really don't have enough data at the moment to really understand how that is distributed. And if you do it in lab, you also get log normal distributions. And so the variability appears to be inherent in wood burners. Whether they are genuinely random or not, it remains to be seen, but they behave as if they are, so you might as well treat them as if they are. Which leads me to think that the emissions factors that we've got at the moment are probably about as good as they're going to get. The composition, the toxicity is different compared to whether you've got a wood smoke or a traffic dominated source. In wood burning areas, if you've got a wood burner, the concentrations of PM inside your house can actually be considerably higher than the concentrations outside. There is spatial variation in wood smoke. It has very steep gradients, and it's sensitive to effects such as topography, meteorology. But we think the Kernel approach, these dense networks using participant engagement seems to work, and it's a technique that we are going to develop. It's relatively cheap, although, as Ian has put it on more than one occasion, cheap monitors don't mean cheap monitoring. Yep. But the participants appear to like it. We've had a very good retention of participants over the 3 years we've been doing it. So we will carry on doing more. And we will do that by developing these instruments into wireless networks so that we can give real-time feedback to our participants. One thing I would find interesting would be following the real-life emissions in houses for longer periods of time. But if we want to do more houses, more homes, then low-cost technology is probably the way to do it. You know, if a dust sensor is $20 a piece, they're pretty much disposable. You can put one on a chimney, and if it breaks, it doesn't matter. Whereas the previous way of doing the real-life emissions was phenomenally expensive. If I remember correctly, you were looking at something like about $15,000 a house. And if you need to do hundreds of houses, that's just not going to happen. So what we will work towards with what we're doing is high resolution exposure measurements, high resolution exposure estimates for epidemiology. And one of the things about life in New Zealand is that we have a population, particularly in the small towns of New Zealand, whose only exposure to pollution is wood smoke during the winter. They have very little traffic pollution, they have very little industrial pollution. And if you aggregate all those up, you could well have a large enough population to actually do epidemiology on. And the other thing about the Kona technique, understanding the effects of meteorology, topography, we now need to try that somewhere else. So this is probably the last year we'll be in Rangiora. Next year we will go somewhere else and see if what we've learned there applies in different places with different physical characteristics, so that we can start to make predictions for places where you haven't or can't monitor. And on the health effects front, we'll start to look at these techniques will give us the ability to understand interventions better, to assess interventions. We've just mentioned doing epidemiology of wood smoke, including the effects of lead and arsenic. On the interventions front, what the study in this Northern Hemisphere winter will look at interventions in a town in Idaho, which I'll come to in a moment, and giving people real-time feedback on how their wood-burning behaviour is affecting their exposure and exposure of their neighbours. Will that lead them to make their own interventions? And can we get them to try just doing something different to see what happens? And another study that Perry Davey at GNS has mentioned he would like to carry out is just looking at contaminated ash disposal, because as you can imagine, if you're burning all this treated timber, we've got arsenic and lead everywhere. What happens to the ash after you've burnt it? And so in the West Silver Valley in Idaho, the US EPA, or what's left of the US EPA, is putting $2.5 million into an intervention study. And we will take the Kona method to Idaho to look at the effects of those interventions. And also, most of you will of course be aware, since it was the main reason that you know about this talk, of the International Woodsmoke Researchers Network. And the aim is that this will now be a coalition of researchers working together to compare notes, to plan for future studies. Things like we then have 2 winters available. One, a southern hemisphere winter, a northern hemisphere winter. Kit can be used all the time, and we can share our strengths. And we will be actively looking for opportunities to join together for research in the future. The end. So I'll open the floor for questions. How are we taking online questions? Are they people typing them in? Okay.
So just repeat them then.
Yep, okay.
What is the research? This is from Villani. What is the research in NZ analyzed explained indoor pollution is worse than outdoor? Is this for houses when wood burners are in operation?
So the question was about the fact that in some houses, indoor pollution measurements are higher than the outdoor pollution measurements, and is that because there's a wood burner? We think so. So that's the assumption at the moment, because that was measured in houses with wood burners. Yeah. The question is actually that we've been working on, and the reason we started with the Pac-Man idea was to separate out that wood burner from all the other internal sources in a house to try and definitively say, yes, it's your wood burner.
You mentioned the lead and arsenic. The lead is quite well explained and kind of obvious, but the arsenic, I'm surprised that it's such a big deal. And where does it? It's not from coating, so where does it come from?
Okay, so the question was, where does the arsenic come from in burnt wood? And it's from treating wood with copper, chrome, arsenic preservatives. So in somewhere in the back of what passes for a memory, I think in some countries around the world that is no longer allowed, but it is still allowed here.
Do you have a feeling of if you burn treated timber, what levels are you exposed to compared to what's found outside? Because that's the other thing you can say as well.
Yeah, so the question was, if you burn treated timber, are you exposed to more indoors than outside, or to the levels? I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, so if you're burning treated timber and the pollution levels are higher inside your house, then your exposure will be greater. But no, I can't give you a number for that. Perry might. If any of the GNS guys are online, can they answer that? You would have thought so, wouldn't you?
Another online question from Stephen. What is the compliance monitor?
Okay, the compliance monitor at Rangiora, I think, is a TIOM. And it's measuring PM10. I don't know if they're measuring PM2.5 there. Yeah, because for those who are not in New Zealand, our legislation is still based on PM10, sorry. There's been talk of changing that and bringing in a PM2.5 standard, but as yet, nothing has actually happened. Jamie.
Another question. So you went to the small town and found that Woodsmoke was the major route. And then I often hear about Christchurch. You know, Christchurch in the winter is very bad. So in that regard, it seems like they'll have the wood smoke in the winter, plus the pollution from cars and things like that. Any idea or feeling as to how the percentage of the, you know, let's say in the summer, wood smoke is there, so it's 100% traffic, and then in the winter, is it 50-50, is it 75-25? Is there any feeling for that, or any ideas for future study of Christchurch? Because that's a large population. It seems like, and when I hear about it, I always hear Christchurch really bad.
Yep. I'm going to duck that question. I'm going to pass it to Ian. So the question was about Christchurch being a fairly large town. It's about 300, 400,000 people. Will not be an entirely wood smoke dominated airshed. So what percentage of pollution comes from wood smoke as opposed to, say, traffic? That's the question.
I'm partly going to duck the question as well, but I will mention that GNS Science, based here in New Zealand, they've been doing source apportionment studies to answer precisely that question for more than 10 years. They've recently started work in Christchurch, and they have a couple of reports on just that. But as a kind of ballpark figure, the contribution of wood smoke to Christchurch's PM has dropped significantly in the last decade, but it still dominates winter PM there. So I would say it's more than 50% and it's less than 90%. That's about as precise as I'm going to be online. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Another question from Gus. What are the air quality management implications of the fact that the wood burners have a distribution of emissions? What can we do if we can't have one emission factor?
Thank you, Gus. So the question was about the distribution of emissions from wood burners. If you can't have a single emissions factor, what does that do for air quality management? You can take a single emissions factor from a log normal distribution. You just use the geometric mean instead of the arithmetic one. That's as close as you'll get to a single number. But what I think is more interesting as a possibility is that you can then do simulations using the entire distribution. So Tim Mallett in Christchurch at HECAN was running Monte Carlo type simulations to try and work out how many wood burners he needed to remove to achieve the air quality legislation targets. And so that's the kind of thing you can use then. You can use a distribution of emissions instead of a single emission to get a better spread of what your pollution is going to look like. Carol.
Working in Europe with the Pac-Man, did individual householders change their behaviour from the information that they were getting over these last few years? Did less people now use fires? Have they changed?
So the question was, has anybody changed their behaviour from having a Pac-Man in their house yet? Not really, not so far. The problem at the moment is the feedback loop is fairly slow because we have to wait until the end of the season to give them the information. So this is what we're hoping for. Once the things are networked and we can get the data off them in real time, we can automate the processing of that and we can give them real time pretty much information on their behavior, so they will then be able to see how their behavior changes things. But at the moment the feedback is too slow to be able to really influence how people behave.
After all your research, would you have a wood burner in your own home?
So the question was, would I have a wood burner in my own home? No.
Nearly to a pellet burner.
Probably not. We have heat pumps. I like heat pumps. They're just so much easier. And we buy our electricity from a company that claims to be 100% renewable. So,
Don't live in the deep south either.
and no, the consequences of any power outage are not that great living this far north in New Zealand. But it's, as a comment on that, so there was a comment about living a long way south in New Zealand, and also really, if I understood you correctly, was about the reliability of the electricity supply. And there's a lot of people talk about the reliability of this electricity supply in New Zealand, but my experience is it's no worse than anywhere else I've lived. You know, it really isn't that bad. These kinds of things happen wherever you live in the world. So I wouldn't worry about that too much.
Okay, at that point, I'm going to call time. Thanks everyone for turning up here and listening in Auckland, and thanks for all our online viewers. This presentation will be available on the Woodsmoke Researchers Network website, hopefully indefinitely, and please keep an eye out. We'll hopefully have some more webinars coming soon. Thank you very much.